In any sport, greatness is difficult to define. Do you look at individual accolades or team achievements? What stats should you value? Does it matter who had the highest peak, or is longevity more important? In climbing, the task is even harder. The sport spans so many different eras and includes so many different disciplines that trying to compare climbers against each other is almost impossible. In my opinion, the definition of greatness varies too much for there to be any one answer. We've seen too many amazing climbers for there to be a definitive GOAT. However, depending on how you frame it, I think you can pick out 7 climbers from the long history of the sport who each have a convincing argument to be made as the greatest of all time. Some of them are specialists, others dabbled in all areas. The one thing they all have in common, though, is that they all have a sense and achievements to their name that no other climber alive at the time was able to pull off. They each have their own claim to being the greatest climber of all time, and I'm going to lay them out for you one by one. So without further ado, this is my presentation of the 7 best rock climbers the world has ever seen. This is Making the Case, and today, the greatest climber of all time is Wolfgang Gullich. Hey everyone, welcome back to Making the Case, where I've chosen the 7 climbers who I think have arguments to be made as the GOAT, and I'm going to go through them one at a time. Today, we're going to be focusing on Wolfgang Gullich. Now, in 1963, Lionel Terray published one of the most well-known climbing books of all time, titled Conquistadors of the Useless. In it, Terray outlines the somewhat pointless goal of rock climbing and mountaineering, finding not necessarily the easiest way up something, but sometimes the hardest. Really, if you get down to it, this is what rock climbing is all about, finding the hardest available route, that perfect line between doable and unachievable, and getting it done. The definition of what constitutes hard may have changed over the years, but that singular goal hasn't, and cast in that light, the standout greatest rock climber of all time is Wolfgang Gullich. Making the case for Wolfgang is simple. It can essentially be summed up in one sentence. He climbed more hard things in his career than any other climber has. Put another way, he is responsible for the most grade pushes of any climber ever. Really, it's that easy. If the goal of climbing is to send the hardest thing possible, no one pushed the envelope more than Wolfgang did. In the 7-year stretch between 1984 and 1991, he was responsible for establishing the grades of 8B, 8B+, 8C, and 9A, with the ascents of Kanal im Rücken, Punks in the Gym, Wall Street, and the world-famous Action Direct. That's absolutely insane. For reference, it took Chris Sharma 7 years to go from 9A+ to 9B. Wolfgang set 4 grades in that time period. It was, and still is, an absolutely unprecedented show of dominance, strength, and climbing talent. Really, I could just end the video here. The point of climbing is to climb hard. Compared to the other people at his time, Wolfgang climbed harder than anyone else ever has. Case closed. When you dig in though, Wolfgang's impact actually went farther than that, and I think it's worth highlighting. He was more than just a really good climber. He was a figurehead of one of the sport's most important movements, and he's one of the reasons that climbing is where it is today. During the late 80s and early 90s, the climbing world was undergoing a transformative period where sport climbing, the use of bolts drilled into the wall for protection, and techniques like hang dogging, resting on your rope to work a sequence instead of coming off the route every time you fell, were becoming more popular. With this newfound popularity, though, also came a fair degree of controversy. There were some people within the sport who found these new developments, well, maybe not unethical, to be a less pure form of climbing. Many of the old guard, especially in America, saw these techniques as something lesser and not as valid as a ground-up trad ascent was. The Patagonia film Rock Punk does a great job outlining the divide this caused between the old school and new school climbers. Sport climbing was a countercultural movement, something that wasn't yet fully accepted into the established circles of the best climbers in the world. Wolfgang broke this exclusionary attitude wide open. He was more than just a figurehead of the sport climbing movement. He was an immutable force, something that was so good that he just couldn't be denied. He was far and away the strongest climber in the world, and he, along with others like Jerry Moffat and Ben Moon, helped to move the sport into its next era, one that I would argue it's still in today. Wolfgang's ability to do this came from a mixture of factors. First, obviously there was his insane strength, both in terms of fingers and overall power. I mean, just look at this guy. He invented modern training techniques like the campus board, which is still used today for climbers to increase their crimping strength and work on dynamic movements. Wolfgang wasn't just strong though. He was incredibly good at harnessing his power in a really smooth, controlled way, holding himself in difficult positions so that he could find the right hand placement or the exact perfect foothold. His power may have been the core of everything he did, and it may be what he's known best for, but I think what really allowed Wolfgang to be special was the technique underlying it all and how he was able to put everything together. Additionally, I think Wolfgang was able to legitimize sport climbing because he wasn't just a sport climber. When you look at the style of climbs he did in the Franken era and his most famous ascents, it's easy to chalk him up as a new school, power-based climber who could only throw these wild moves because he had the safety of drilled bolts to catch him. In reality though, Wolfgang was an incredibly well-rounded alpinist who put up hard ascents in a variety of different styles. He sent difficult routes on the delicate, shallow faces of Boucs, France. He worked terrifying lines on English gritstone, which led him to breaking his back on an intentional test fall. He put up hard crack climbs in Yosemite, including his famous free solo of Separate Reality, and made daring first ascents in Patagonia and the Karakoram Range. Speaking on one of his most famous routes, Riders of the Storm, Arc'teryx athlete Ines Papert said, "This stunning line on the sheer 1,300 meter east face of Torres Central went at 7C A3. The climbing is very varied and demanding, ranging from delicate and run-out face climbing to wide cracks in roofs, which are often entirely iced up. It's harder to imagine something farther away from action direct than this climb is." I think this, more than anything else, is what helped Wolfgang move rock climbing into the sport era. It was impossible to write him off as simply a single-pitch phenom, someone who thrived on strength-based routes but wouldn't be able to keep up on the old-school, daring, and more dangerous style of climbing that previous generations had participated in. Wolfgang partook in these methods too, and he was able to modify his strength and control so that he could thrive in any environment, be it an overhung crack climb or a 1,000-meter cliff in the Himalayas. Wolfgang may have not been the best crack climber of his generation or the best big wall climber, but I think I can comfortably say that from the period of 84 to 91, he was far and away the strongest climber in the world. Again, at its core, rock climbing is about finding the most difficult routes to get up. You can argue all you want about trad versus sport and the ethics of hangdogging, but at the end of the day, the fact remains that no one has ever pushed the boundaries of grades as far, as quickly as Wolfgang did. We've never seen someone who is so dominant in one aspect of climbing like Güllich was in sport climbing. This is even more impressive when you consider how good he was at other types of rock climbing, and when you take it all together, Punks in the Gym, Riders on the Storm, Separate Reality, and Eternal Flame, and Action Direct, and all the rest, Wolfgang Gullich stands alone as the greatest rock climber we've ever seen. I think, out of respect, I want to end this video by touching on his own personal philosophies and beliefs. While Wolfgang did push grades and move the sport in a new era, that wasn't what was important to him. Rock climbing to Güllich was a personal and social endeavor, an outlet for creativity and the beauty of movement that you got to share with those you loved. I think this quote by Johann von Schag sums it up perfectly. For Wolfgang, climbing was about more than sending the hardest routes in the world. It was a human pursuit. Climbing is about the connections we make, be it at our local cliff or at an iconic overseas crag that fills both our day and night time dreams, or sometimes it's simply shooting the breeze at the cafe or the pub. That was the philosophy of Wolfgang Gullich. In an ever increasingly competitive environment, at a time when he was easily the best climber in the world, he shied away from the fame and one-upsmanship, instead focusing on the climbs he did and the friends he made along the way. He almost accidentally completely redefined the history and ethos of climbing, pushed limits in all areas of the sport, and put up the most impressive stretch of grade increases we've ever seen, and that's what makes him the greatest of all time.